The morning of December 16, 1944, began with an eerie silence that would haunt Sergeant Thomas Mitchell for the rest of his life. Snow fell softly through the skeletal branches of the Ardennes forest, blanketing the American positions in deceptive tranquility. The men of the 106th Infantry Division huddled in their foxholes, no breath visible in the frigid air, unaware that they stood at the epicenter of what would become Adolf Hitler's final desperate gamble on the Western Front. Mitchell adjusted his wool cap and peered through the morning mist. Something felt wrong. The German lines, usually active with sporadic artillery fire and patrol movements, had been unnaturally quiet for 3 days. Instincts, honed by months of combat across Europe, screamed danger. But the intelligence. Reports assured them that the Wehrmacht was finished, retreating on all fronts. The war would be over by Christmas, they said. At exactly 5:30 that morning, the earth erupted in hellfire. Over 2,000 German artillery pieces, concentrated along an 85-mile front, opened fire simultaneously. The barrage was unlike anything the Americans had experienced since DAT. Shells screamed overhead, exploding among the snow-covered pine trees with devastating effect. The peaceful winter landscape transformed into a nightmare of splintered wood, flying shrapnel and desperate screams. Private First Class Johnny Rodriguez, barely 19 years old, from San Antonio, Texas, pressed himself against the frozen ground as a shell exploded 20 yards away. Dirt and snow rained down on his helmet. "What the hell is happening?" he shouted over the thunderous bombardment to his squad leader, Staff Sergeant William O'Brien, a veteran of the Normandy campaign. O'Brien's weathered face was grim as he checked his Thompson submachine gun. "The Krauts are throwing everything they've got at us, kid. This ain't no ordinary attack." He'd seen enough warfare to recognize the signs of a major offensive. The intensity and coordination of the artillery barrage suggested something far more significant than a local counterattack. In his command bunker, 3 miles behind the front lines, Colonel James Harrison of the 422nd Infantry Regiment frantically worked his field telephone. Communication lines were being severed faster than his engineers could repair them. Reports flooded in from all sectors, massive artillery bombardment, followed by tank movements and infantry assaults. But the scope of the attack defied comprehension. According to historical records from the National Archives, German forces had assembled over 200,000 troops, including elite SS Panzer divisions that were supposed to be defending the Reich itself. The operation codename Wacht am Rhein, or Watch on the Rhine, represented Hitler's last-ditch effort to split the Allied forces and recapture the vital port of Antwerp as the artillery barrage lifted after 90 minutes of continuous pounding. A new sound emerged from the forest, the distinctive rumble of German tanks. Mitchell raised his head cautiously from his foxhole and felt his blood freeze. Through the smoke and swirling snow, he could see the angular silhouettes of panzer tanks advancing through the trees, their tracks churning up the frozen ground. Behind them came waves of German infantry in white winter camouflage, moving with the precision of seasoned veterans. "Here they come," O'Brien bellowed, raising his Thompson. The Battle of the Bulge had begun, and for the next 6 weeks, these snow-covered hills would witness some of the most savage fighting of the entire European campaign. The morning mist clung to the Ardennes like a shroud as Oberst Friedrich Kellner surveyed the advancing columns of the 1st SS Panzer Division through his field glasses. The initial artillery barrage had exceeded all expectations, shattering American defensive positions across the entire front. Now came the crucial phase, exploiting the breakthrough before the Americans could reorganize their scattered forces. Kellner, a decorated veteran of the Eastern Front, understood the precarious nature of their situation. Operation Watch on the Rhine was built on speed and surprise. Every hour of delay allowed the Americans to bring their overwhelming material superiority to bear. His King Tiger tanks, some of the most formidable weapons in the German arsenal, consumed fuel at an alarming rate. They failed to capture Allied fuel depots within the first 48 hours. The offensive would collapse under its own weight. The first American positions fell within hours. The inexperienced troops of the 106th Infantry Division, many seeing combat for the first time, were overwhelmed by the ferocity of the German assault. The entire company simply vanished in the chaos, their positions overrun by screaming SS troopers who showed no mercy to prisoners. Sergeant Mitchell found himself leading a desperate fighting withdrawal through the snow-laden forest. His original squad of 12 men had been reduced to 6 after the morning's bombardment. They moved carefully through the trees, avoiding the main roads where German armor rolled forward with increasing confidence. Encountered other American survivors scattered, remnants of companies and battalions that had been shattered in the initial assault. "Sarge, we gotta fall back to the crossroads at Sankt Vith," gasped Private Rodriguez, his face pale with exhaustion and shock. The young Texan had witnessed horrors that morning that would haunt his dreams for decades. German SS troops had executed captured Americans at several locations, violating the Geneva Convention with calculated brutality. Staff Sergeant O'Brien wiped blood from a shrapnel wound on his forehead. "The kid's right. We need to link up with whatever's left of regiment." He had fought in North Africa and Italy, but nothing had prepared him for the savage intensity of this German counteroffensive. The Wehrmacht was supposed to be a spent force, yet here they were, advancing with the confidence and coordination of their earlier victories, as documented in Stephen Ambrose's Citizen Soldiers. The German breakthrough created a bulge in Allied lines that extended 60 miles wide and 50 miles deep into American-held territory. The psychological impact was as devastating as the tactical surprise. American troops who had grown accustomed to steady advances since D-Day suddenly found themselves in full retreat. By evening of the first day, German spearheads had penetrated 15 miles into American lines. Kampfgruppe Piper, led by the notorious SS Obersturmbannführer Joachim Piper, had broken through near Losheim and was racing toward the Meuse River. Their Tiger tanks crushed American resistance with methodical efficiency, leaving burning Sherman tanks scattered along the snow-covered roads. Colonel Harrison's command post had been overrun by nightfall. The colonel himself barely escaped capture, lending the remnants of his headquarters company through frozen streams and dense undergrowth. Radio communication with higher headquarters remained sporadic at best. The carefully planned American defensive positions had simply disintegrated under the weight of the German assault. In the town of Malmedy, American military policemen and engineers were hastily destroying fuel dumps and ammunition depots to prevent their capture. The sound of German vehicles grew louder with each passing hour. Civilians who had welcomed American liberators only months earlier now fled westward, their belongings loaded onto whatever vehicles they could find. Private Rodriguez stumbled through the darkness, following Sergeant Mitchell's barely visible form ahead of him. The temperature had dropped below freezing, and their breath formed clouds in the bitter air. Behind them, the eastern horizon glowed orange from burning American supply dumps. The German breakthrough was complete, and for the first time since Pearl Harbor, American forces faced the possibility of a catastrophic defeat in Europe. The morning of December 17th brought no respite from the German onslaught. Kampfgruppe Piper continued its relentless advance toward the Meuse River, leaving a trail of destruction that would become legendary in the annals of warfare. SS Obersturmbannführer Joachim Piper, commanding this elite armored spearhead, drove his men forward with ruthless determination, knowing that speed remained their only advantage against American numerical superiority. At approximately 1 o'clock in the afternoon, Battery B of the 285th Field Artillery Observation Battalion found itself in the wrong place at the worst possible time. The unit, consisting of roughly 140 men, was retreating westward along the road near Malmedy when they encountered the lead elements of Piper's armored column. The Americans, caught completely by surprise, had no choice but to surrender. Sergeant Mitchell and his surviving squad members watched the drama unfold from a ridge overlooking the crossroads. They had been moving parallel to the main road, hoping to reach American lines near Sankt Vith, when the distinctive rumble of German armor filled the air. Through the falling snow, they could see American soldiers emerging from their vehicles with hands raised in surrender. "Jesus Christ," whispered Private Rodriguez, his voice barely audible over the wind. "There must be 100 guys down there." The young Texan had witnessed enough combat to know that prisoners of war were supposed to receive protection under international law. What happened next would violate every convention of civilized warfare. "Staff." Sergeant O'Brien lowered his field glasses with shaking hands. "Those aren't regular Wehrmacht troops," he said grimly. "Those are SS. Look at the skulls on their collars." He had heard rumors about SS treatment of prisoners on the Eastern Front, but this was the first time he had encountered Hitler's elite formations in person. The American prisoners were herded into a snow-covered field adjacent to the crossroads. For several minutes, it appeared that normal prisoner processing would take place. German guards searched the captives for weapons and intelligence materials, while Piper's tanks continued, rolling westward toward their objectives. Then, without warning, the situation changed dramatically. According to testimony later given at the Nuremberg war crimes trials, the massacre began when an SS officer drew his pistol and shot an American medical officer who was tending to wounded prisoners. This single shot seemed to trigger a frenzy of violence among the German guards. Machine guns opened fire on the defenseless Americans, cutting them down in the freezing field like wheat before a scythe. The sound of sustained machine gun fire echoed across the snow-covered landscape for nearly 10 minutes. When the shooting finally stopped, 84 American soldiers lay dead in the crimson-stained snow. Those who had survived the initial volley by playing dead remained motionless, hoping to escape notice. Several wounded Americans attempted to crawl toward the nearby woods, only to be hunted down and executed with pistol shots to the head. Private First Class Kenneth Ahrens, one of the few survivors, later testified the German soldiers walked among the bodies, shooting anyone who showed signs of life. Some Americans who had been only wounded in the initial machine gun fire were beaten to death with rifle butts. The brutality was systematic and thorough, designed to ensure that no witnesses survived to report the atrocity. From their concealed position on the ridge, Mitchell's squad watched in horrified silence as the massacre unfolded below them. Rodriguez began to raise his rifle, but O'Brien grabbed his arm. "Don't even think about it, kid," the sergeant whispered urgently. "There's nothing we can do for those poor bastards now, and if we open fire, we'll just get ourselves killed too." The psychological impact of witnessing such systematic brutality was profound. These American soldiers had been raised on concepts of fair play and adherence to international law. The casual execution of helpless prisoners represented a level of depravity that challenged their fundamental understanding of warfare. Many would carry the mental scars of this scene for the rest of their lives, as Piper's column resumed its advance. Leaving the field of corpses behind, word of the massacre began to spread among American forces. Radio operators transmitted fragmentary reports of the atrocity, and the news traveled quickly through the demoralized ranks. The Malmedy Massacre, as it would become known to history, transformed the nature of the Battle of the Bulge from a conventional military engagement into a fight for survival against an enemy that recognized no rules of civilized conduct. As news of the Malmedy Massacre spread through American ranks like wildfire, the character of the battle transformed completely. What had begun as a tactical withdrawal now became a desperate fight for survival against an enemy that showed no mercy to prisoners. The frozen crossroads town of Sankt Vith emerged as a crucial strongpoint, where American forces would make their first serious attempt to halt the German breakthrough. Brigadier General Bruce Clark of Combat Command B, 7th Armored Division, arrived in Sankt Vith on the evening of December 17th with explicit orders from General Omar Bradley. Hold the town at all costs. The strategic importance of Sankt Vith lay in its position as a vital road junction. If German forces could capture and hold the town, they would have direct access to multiple routes leading toward the Meuse River, and ultimately to Antwerp. Clark found the situation far worse than intelligence reports had indicated.
The town
Was already crowded with thousands of American stragglers from units that had been shattered in the initial German assault. Equipment and vehicles were scattered throughout the streets in chaotic disorder. Many soldiers had abandoned their weapons during the retreat, and morale had plummeted to dangerous levels following reports of the prisoner executions. Sergeant Lessel's reduced squad reached the outskirts of Saint-Vith just as German artillery began falling on the town. The bombardment was lighter than the devastating barrage that had opened the offensive, but it was precisely targeted at known American positions. German forward observers, infiltrating American lines in captured uniforms, were directing fire with deadly accuracy. "Get those men into defensive positions," General Clark shouted at his subordinate commanders as shells exploded in the town square. The general, a veteran of North African and Italian campaigns, understood that panic was as dangerous as enemy fire. If American forces continued their disorganized retreat, the entire Western Front might collapse within days. Private Rodriguez found himself assigned to defend a stone farmhouse on the eastern edge of town, alongside remnants of 3 different companies. The mixing of units created confusion about command structure and communication procedures, but it also demonstrated the democratic spirit of American forces. Regular Army veterans worked alongside National Guardsmen and draftees, sharing ammunition and encouraging the inexperienced soldiers. Staff Sergeant O'Brien took charge of the improvised defensive position with characteristic efficiency. "Listen up, you guys," he announced to the mixed group of soldiers. "Those SS bastards think they can waltz through here like they're on parade. We're going to show them different." His calm demeanor and obvious combat experience provided reassurance to men who had witnessed the collapse of their units only hours earlier. The first German probing attacks began before dawn on December 18th. Volksgrenadier infantry, supported by assault guns, advanced cautiously through the snow-covered fields surrounding Saint-Vith. These were not the elite SS formations that had spearheaded the breakthrough, but regular Wehrmacht troops whose mission was to reduce American strongpoints while the armor continued westward, as recorded in Charles MacDonald's Official Army History, A Time for Trumpets. The defense of Saint-Vith represented a crucial turning point in the Battle of the Bulge. For the first time since the offensive began, American forces fought from prepared positions with adequate ammunition and clear fields of fire. The psychological impact of making a successful stand, however temporary, began to restore confidence in demoralized units. The farmhouse where Rodriguez and his comrades waited had been transformed into a miniature fortress. Windows were blocked with furniture and sandbags, while firing ports were carefully positioned to provide overlapping fields of fire. The Americans had learned hard lessons about German tactical superiority during the initial breakthrough, and they applied those lessons to their defensive preparations. Through his rifle scope, Mitchell watched German infantry advancing in small groups, using natural cover and tactical movement that demonstrated professional competence. These were not the fanatical SS troops who had committed the Malmedy atrocity, but seasoned soldiers who understood their business. The engagement would test whether American forces could recover from their initial shock and fight effectively against Germany's best remaining troops. As morning mist began to lift from the frozen fields, the battle for Saint-Vith commenced in earnest. The outcome would determine whether the German offensive could maintain its momentum or whether American resistance would begin to stiffen across the entire front. The dawn of December 19th brought with it the full fury of German determination. To capture Saint-Vith, Oberst Friedrich Kellner, now commanding elements of 3 different Volksgrenadier divisions, understood that every hour of delay allowed American reinforcements to strengthen their defensive positions. The Wehrmacht's carefully planned timetable was already falling behind schedule, and pressure from higher headquarters demanded immediate results. The attack began with a concentrated artillery barrage that shattered windows throughout the town and sent civilians scrambling for basement shelters. German shells, firing from positions only 3 miles away, struck with devastating accuracy. The stone church tower, which had served as an American observation post, collapsed in a thunderous crash that could be heard above the ongoing bombardment. In the farmhouse on the eastern perimeter, Sergeant Mitchell's improvised squad waited in tense silence as shells exploded around their position. The building shook with each near miss, and plaster fell from the ceiling in choking clouds. Private Rodriguez gripped his M1 Garand rifle so tightly that his knuckles had turned white. The young Texan had come a long way from the frightened recruit who had first encountered German fire only 3 days earlier. "Remember what I taught you about fire discipline," Staff Sergeant O'Brien reminded the mixed group of soldiers under his command. "Don't waste ammunition on long-range shots. Wait until you can see the whites of their eyes, then make every round count." The veteran non-commissioned officer had reorganized the defense of their sector with methodical efficiency, positioning his most experienced men where they could provide leadership to the newer soldiers. When the artillery barrage lifted, infantry emerged from the tree line 400 yards away. The Volksgrenadiers advanced in extended formation, taking advantage of every fold in the ground and piece of available cover. Their white winter camouflage made them difficult to distinguish against the snow-covered landscape, and their tactical movement demonstrated the professional competence that had made the Wehrmacht one of history's most effective fighting forces. According to Hugh Cole's official army history, the Ardennes Battle of the Bulge, the fighting around Sankt Vith developed into some of the most savage close-quarters combat of the entire European campaign. American defenders fighting from hastily prepared positions faced repeated assaults by German troops who were themselves under enormous pressure to achieve breakthrough objectives. The first German assault wave reached the farmhouse perimeter. At exactly 8:30 in the morning, Mitchell opened fire with his Thompson submachine gun, cutting down to Volksgrenadiers who were attempting to breach the stone wall surrounding the courtyard. The sharp crack of American rifles mixed with the heavier sound of German machine pistols as the engagement developed into a deadly firefight at point-blank range. Private Rodriguez found himself facing a German soldier who had climbed through a window on the ground floor. The two young men, separated by nationality and ideology, but united in their desperate desire to survive, grappled hand-to-hand in the narrow hallway. Rodriguez's bayonet training proved decisive as he drove his blade between the German's ribs, ending the struggle with brutal efficiency. Throughout the morning, German attacks continued with relentless persistence. Each assault was beaten back, but at enormous cost to both sides. American ammunition supplies dwindled rapidly, and several defensive positions had to be abandoned when casualties made them untenable. The frozen ground made digging new foxholes nearly impossible, forcing defenders to improvise cover from rubble and debris. General Clark, monitoring the battle from his command post in the town center, realized that Sankt Vith could not be held indefinitely against such determined attacks. Radio messages from higher headquarters painted an increasingly grim picture of the overall situation. German armored spearheads were approaching the Meuse River at several points, and American reserves were being committed piecemeal to contain multiple breakthrough attempts by noon. German forces had penetrated the outer defensive perimeter at 3 different locations. Street fighting erupted throughout the eastern sectors of the town as American defenders fell back from position to position. The stone buildings that had provided excellent defensive positions now became death traps as German assault teams used explosive charges and flamethrowers to clear American strongpoints. The temperature had dropped to -10 degrees Fahrenheit. Adding the additional enemy of severe cold to an already desperate situation, wounded men froze to death within minutes if they could not be evacuated to heated buildings. Weapons malfunctioned in the extreme cold. Soldiers on both sides struggled with frostbite and hypothermia that were as dangerous as enemy bullets. As afternoon shadows lengthened across the snow-covered battlefield, it became clear that Sankt Vith would fall before nightfall. The question was no longer whether American forces could hold the town, but whether they could conduct an organized withdrawal that would preserve their remaining combat effectiveness for future battles. The order to evacuate Sankt Vith reached General Clark's command post at 4:15 on the afternoon of December 20. Lieutenant General Courtney Hodges, commanding the First Army, had finally acknowledged what frontline commanders had known for hours. The town could not be held against continued German pressure. The withdrawal would have to be conducted under Enemy fire through snow-covered terrain. With thousands of wounded and stragglers who had lost their original units, Sergeant Mitchell received the evacuation order with mixed emotions. The farmhouse position had become home to his improvised squad over the past 3 days, and abandoning it felt like surrendering to the enemy. Yet he understood the tactical reality of their situation. German forces now controlled the high ground on 3 sides of the town, and continued resistance would only result in the complete destruction of American forces in the sector. "All right, you guys, we're pulling out," he announced to the exhausted soldiers under his command. "Take only essential equipment and ammunition. We've got a long march ahead of us, and every extra pound is going to feel like 10 by the time we reach friendly lines." The withdrawal would cover nearly 15 miles through contested territory, where German patrols and infiltrators posed constant threats. Private Rodriguez helped carry Corporal James Murphy, who had been wounded by shell fragments. During the morning's fighting, the young Texan had matured dramatically during the past week, transforming from an inexperienced recruit into a seasoned combat veteran. The horrors he had witnessed at Malmedy and the desperate fighting around Sankt Vith had forged him into a different person entirely. Staff Sergeant O'Brien supervised the destruction of remaining supplies that could not be carried during the withdrawal. American forces followed a strict policy of denying usable equipment to enemy forces. Even when such destruction meant going without items that might prove essential later, cases of ammunition were blown up with thermite grenades in vehicles that could not be evacuated were disabled with sledgehammers and explosive charges. The evacuation began at dusk under cover of a diversionary artillery barrage fired by the remaining American guns in the sector. German forces, anticipating a final assault on their positions, were caught off guard by the sudden cessation of resistance from Sankt Vith. By the time Volksgrenadier patrols discovered the abandoned American positions, most of the defenders had already begun their westward march, according to John Eisenhower's The Bitter Woods. The withdrawal from Sankt Vith represented both a tactical defeat and a strategic victory for American forces. While the town itself was lost, the delay imposed on German timetables proved crucial to the ultimate failure of Operation Watch on the Rhine. Every hour that Wehrmacht forces spent reducing American strongpoints was an hour that could not be devoted to the drive toward Antwerp, the march westward through the Ardennes. Forrest tested the endurance of men who were already exhausted by days of continuous combat. Snow continued to fall, covering the narrow forest trails with treacherous footing that made movement slow and dangerous. German patrols infiltrating behind American lines posed constant threats to the withdrawing columns. Mitchell's squad, with hundreds of others scattered throughout the forest, moved in single file through the darkness. Each man maintained physical contact with the soldier ahead of him to prevent the group from becoming separated in the confusing terrain. Navigation relied on compass headings and occasional landmarks that were difficult too. Identifying the snow-covered landscape, Private First Class Danny Sullivan, a replacement who had joined the unit only 2 weeks earlier, collapsed from exhaustion after 6 hours of continuous marching. The temperature had dropped to -15 degrees Fahrenheit. Several soldiers were showing signs of severe frostbite. O'Brien made the difficult decision to leave Sullivan with a group of other casualties who would have to surrender if discovered by German patrols. The psychological impact of the withdrawal was as significant as its tactical implications. American soldiers who had grown accustomed to steady advances since D-Day now found themselves in full retreat from an enemy they had believed to be nearly defeated. Many questioned whether the war in Europe might continue for months or even years longer than originally anticipated. Dawn found Mitchell's group approximately 10 miles west of Sankt Vith, still moving through dense forests that provided concealment from German air reconnaissance. Behind them, smoke columns rose from the abandoned town as Wehrmacht engineers worked to restore damaged bridges and roadways. The German advance would continue, but its momentum had been significantly reduced by the stubborn American defense. Radio communications with higher headquarters remained sporadic, but fragmentary reports indicated that American reinforcements were moving toward the battle area from all directions. the strategic reserve that General Eisenhower had been hoarding for the final assault on Kassel. Germany was now being committed to contain the German breakthrough. The Battle of the Bulge had become the largest engagement fought by American forces during the entire war. Christmas Eve, 1944. Found Sergeant Mitchell and the survivors of his unit digging foxholes in the frozen ground outside the Belgian town of Bastogne. The strategic crossroads, defended by the 101st Airborne Division under Brigadier General Anthony McAuliffe, had become the focal point of the entire German offensive. Hitler himself had declared that Bastogne must be taken at all costs. Recognizing that American control of the vital road junction threatened the entire Wehrmacht advance, the reinforcement of Bastogne represented a dramatic shift in American fortunes since the dark days following the initial German breakthrough. General George Patton's Third Army had executed one of military history's most remarkable maneuvers, pivoting 90 degrees from offensive operations in Lorraine to counterattack the southern flank of the German Bulge. The relief of Bastogne had become Patton's personal obsession. He drove his divisions forward with characteristic ruthlessness. Private Rodriguez, now a seasoned combat veteran despite his youth, cleaned his rifle methodically as German artillery. Shells exploded in the distance. The young Texan had witnessed horrors that would have broken many older men, yet he had emerged from the crucible of battle with his essential humanity intact. The massacre at Malmedy had taught him that war could descend to levels of depravity beyond imagination. But it had also reinforced his determination to fight for the values that separated civilized nations from barbarian regimes. Staff Sergeant O'Brien studied the tactical situation through field glasses borrowed from a forward observer team. German forces had completely surrounded Bastogne, but their siege lines were stretched thin across a wide perimeter. Wehrmacht commanders faced the same logistical problems that had plagued the entire offensive: insufficient fuel, ammunition shortages, and supply lines that extended far beyond sustainable limits. The famous German ultimatum demanding surrender of Bastogne had been delivered 2 days earlier, and General McAuliffe's one-word response of "nuts" had already become legend among American troops. The psychological impact of the airborne division's defiant, stand-inspired soldiers throughout the entire European theater. If the elite paratroopers could hold against overwhelming odds, then perhaps the German offensive might be contained after all. According to Stephen Ambrose's Band of Brothers, the siege of Bastogne demonstrated the resilience of American forces when properly led and adequately supplied. The airborne defenders, supported by elements of the 10th Armored Division and various attached units, fought with a tenacity that surprised German commanders who had expected rapid capitulation. The first elements of Patton's relief column reached the Bastogne perimeter at 4:45 on the afternoon of December 26th. Lieutenant Colonel Creighton Abrams, commanding the 37th Tank Battalion, 4th Armored Division, personally led the breakthrough that shattered German siege lines south of the town. The psychological impact of relief was enormous. Even though tactical situation remained precarious, Mitchell's squad was assigned to support the tank attack that would expand the narrow corridor linking Bastogne with American forces to the south. The operation required infantry to clear German anti-tank positions that threatened the vulnerable supply road. It was dangerous work that demanded precise coordination between armor and foot soldiers. But it represented the first American offensive action since the German breakthrough began. The attack commenced at dawn on December 27th with a concentrated artillery barrage that shattered German positions along the intended axis of advance. American guns, finally available in adequate numbers, fired continuously for 30 minutes before the infantry assault began. The sound of massed artillery was music to soldiers who had endured days of German bombardment without adequate means of retaliation. Private First Class Rodriguez advanced alongside a Sherman tank, using its bulk for protection against German small arms fire. The coordination between tank crews and infantry had improved dramatically since the early days of the Normandy campaign. Tankers understood that they needed infantry protection against German Panzerfaust teams, while foot soldiers appreciated the firepower and psychological support provided by armor. The German defense was stubborn, but lacked the fanatical intensity that had characterized earlier phases of the battle. Wehrmacht troops were exhausted, short of ammunition, increasingly aware that their offensive had failed to achieve its strategic objectives. Many showed willingness to surrender when faced with overwhelming American firepower, a marked contrast to the SS formations that had initiated the breakthrough. By noon, American forces had expanded the Bastogne corridor to a width of 3 miles, providing adequate security for supply convoys moving into the besieged town. German artillery continued to harass the supply route, but systematic counter-battery fire gradually reduced enemy effectiveness. The tide of battle had definitively turned in favor of American forces. The final phase of the Battle of the Bulge would continue for several more weeks as Allied forces methodically reduced the German salient and restored original front lines. But the psychological victory achieved at Bastogne had already determined the ultimate outcome. American forces had met Germany's best remaining troops in battle and emerged victorious. The road to Berlin lay open, and nothing could prevent the final collapse of Hitler's thousand-year Reich. Sergeant Mitchell and his men had survived the greatest test of their lives, forged in the crucible of combat into veterans who would carry the memories of those frozen weeks in the Ardennes for the rest of their days. This historical narrative draws inspiration from multiple sources documenting the Battle of the Bulge, including official Army histories, veteran testimonies, and scholarly works by historians such as Stephen Ambrose, John Eisenhower, and Charles MacDonald. While the individual characters are fictional, their experiences reflect the documented realities faced by American forces during this crucial engagement of World War II.